Hello and welcome to Shaken Not Burned's first live stream, coming to you from SOAS during London Climate Action Week. For those of you who don't know us, we are a sustainability literacy podcast using systems thinking to explore what's happening behind the headlines and how issues that are often treated as separate problems are interconnected. Over the last few years, we've seen climate impacts intensify. Energy markets have become more volatile. We've seen geopolitical tensions increasing. We've seen supply chain disruptions, and trust in institutions has been challenged. At the same time, we've had new technologies emerging faster than many organizations and even many societies can adapt to. And they all have connected impacts. So climate affects food systems and water and infrastructure and insurance. Technology affects jobs and trust and governance, and economic pressures shape the political choices that we have. What we know is that decisions made in one area increasingly has consequences in others. But despite the fact that we have more information, more knowledge at our fingertips than we've ever had before, societies seem to be struggling to respond in a coherent way to risks that are visible. We can see them, we know they're there, but we're not doing anything about them. So we're here with London Climate Action Week focused on implementation, to actually ask why adaptation is so hard. Is it the type of information we have? Is it incentives or institutions, politics, public trust? And what does resilience actually mean? Resilience is now the term that everyone's using after ESG, after sustainability, but it means different things to different people. Is it adapting to change? Is it bouncing forward from a crisis? So today we're going to talk about all of this, and we have a panel bringing a range of perspectives from governance, economics, innovation and system thinking. Harald Heubaum, to my right, is the chair of the Centre for Energy and Climate Policy at SOAS and the co-founder of the Centre for Sustainable Finance. And much of his work in recent years has been about mainstreaming an understanding of climate into governance, working with ministries in different countries to make sure that thinking about climate is part of the routine process of governance, not something disparate or different. Julia Davies is a co-founder of We Have the Power, an impact investor, and she's a founding member of Patriotic Millionaires, working on highlighting the risks and the threats caused by extreme wealth inequality. And I think that's going to be a hugely important part of our conversation today. Through her Funding Nature project, she's also worked to restore multiple nature sites and works on community energy with her partner Tim Strumpf. Last but definitely not least, we have Gosbert Chagula, who's an investor and business builder who recently started Future Impact Ventures and was actually co-founder of the Startup Discovery School. So having worked across the startup and investment ecosystem across Europe and Africa, he's got a really strong understanding of what it takes to build a business to make change. And also, this is something that's particularly of interest to me, which is your work with extra velocities, because that's around finding solutions to urbanization problems. And again, one of the things that's particularly interesting to me is the position of cities. They go up to national governments, they deal with local interests. So if you can understand how to make a city work, you might understand how to make different things work. Anyway, we're going to I'm sorry, I'll just be quiet for that bit because we'll cut that out. Oh, I forgot. Apologies, everybody. It is my first live stream, so I clearly don't know what I'm doing. So what we're going to have today is Harald covering institutions, governance, policy, and collective action. Julia's going to bring an understanding of the importance of power and incentives and wealth concentration, capital allocation, land use, community energy. And Gosbert is going to bring a focus on entrepreneurship, innovation, agency, capability building, all those things that we need to affect change. And then my interest here is as a systems integrator. What do we mean by resilience? How do we deal with uncertainty? How do we turn the knowledge we have and the solutions we've identified into action? So I'm going to start with Harald. My first question to you is, why do you think societies struggle to actually respond to risks that we see, like climate change, or indeed the speed of development of AI?
Thank you, Fee. I think there's a number of components to this. First of all, as you've already outlined, it's a very complex challenge. It requires us to think in a number of different ways and integrated ways. I think different actors, stakeholders in society, including governments and ministries and government, do have a sort of base awareness of there being challenges and risks and problems, but their actions are not very well integrated and coordinated. It could also be that the scale of the challenge is often seen to be rather large and even insurmountable, and that sort of stuns you into not acting at all. Yes, it's also a challenge around mobilizing sufficient amounts of funding. But more than that, I think it's about what we do with the money, how we use it effectively, how we coordinate actions with each other. I think one of the experiences we have from the work we do, and I work on a project that's called RAMP, the Resilience and Adaptation Mainstreaming Program, where we work with the ministries of finance, ministries of planning, core agencies in governments across the global south. The latest iterations of this are in the Caribbean, South Pacific, and Africa, where we see that these ministries tell us, well, we have a climate unit, we are doing work on this, we're doing work on that, but responsibility is spread across a number of different departments, right? And we would like this to be more integrated. We would like to speak to each other more effectively. We would like to use that information that we already have to be able to process it, to turn it into action on the ground.
Okay.
And I think that's part of the challenge, is to actually, what we already have, to use that effectively to respond to those challenges and risks and to find and develop the answers. It's not that there's nothing there, it's that we need to take that next step.
Okay. So in your sense, it's a problem of coordination. But one point you mentioned is that the money's there. There is a lot of finance. And that brings me to you, Julia. Why do you think societies struggle to adapt to risks? Because I think if the money's there to solve a problem.
The money is there. It's just in the wrong hands, and it's in the hands of people who don't want to solve that problem. And it's in the hands of the people who don't want people to know what the problem is. And they want to maintain the status quo. So Patriotic Millionaires, you might think that's a bit of an odd name, but the purpose of Patriotic Millionaires is basically to show that the patriotism which is currently being spread in this country at the moment, which is pretty toxic, that's not true patriotism. Patriotism is supporting the people of your country, and the whole point of our group is that we are people that have wealth, that believe that comes with responsibility, and that comes with paying a fair level of tax. So we advocate for fair taxation of wealth. And within that, so I started out coming at, so I came into my wealth, just to explain my story and how I am. I didn't start off with it. I came into wealth through helping to set up a company. We were a distribution company. We distributed Osprey backpacks and travel bags, sold out of that. And that gave me money to do something about something that I've been aware of and involved with all my life. I've been a member of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth since I was a teenager. And so it gave me some money to do something about that. And there's lots of stories I can tell you about, what I've learned during that process. But during that process, I've ended up doing a lot more on wealth extremism, because that's where we are now, and that's what's stopping us getting there. So I've tried to do various things. I'm very passionate about tackling single-use waste, very passionate about moving us towards renewable energy, tackling overconsumption. All of those things I've tried. I've not succeeded. And I've not succeeded because currently we have those who are basically profiting from that kind of thing. They have the ears of our government, and they are basically blocking these things happening. So I'm just going to hit you with one stat that I worked out this week. I didn't come up with the idea of calculating it like this myself. An academic called Ingrid Robbins, who's written about libertarianism, about what's too much wealth. She did a calculation on Elon Musk's effective hourly rate, because he's just become basically a trillionaire. I really liked what she did. I did my own calculation. I calculated that he's just a little bit younger than me. So he's nearly 55. So I calculated that if he'd worked 60 hours a week from when he was 20, and he'd had just 2 weeks holiday a year. Okay, so I think that's quite a reasonable, way to extrapolate it. Then to have got to a trillionaire by now, that's effectively giving him an hourly rates of pay of nearly $10 million. So this is hourly. Okay. So when people say millionaire, billionaire, trillionaire, I think they think they're similar concepts. They're not. They're incredibly different, So we could do that calculation for a billionaire, because we have now increasing number of billionaires in this country, and we could do that calculation and it would be equally shocking. But, let's start with Elon Musk. And so when anyone says he's worked hard, he's taken risks, he deserves that. I worked hard. I took risks. I never worked harder than a headmistress. I never worked harder than a social worker. So yeah, you could say I took risks. I sold my house. I put all the money into it. I could have lost all my money, because just as lots of the businesses I've invested in, I've seen founders take risks, invest all their money, end up with nothing. That could have happened to me, but it would not have justified that level of extreme concentration of wealth. And the consequence of that extreme concentration of wealth is that we have misinformation. So just one little example of that. So, I'm now very involved in trying to accelerate community energy. And I love that, because that is renewable energy owned by and benefiting communities. So it's basically taking us from a situation where we have oil and gas, our current energy that we rely on, which basically hoovers money up from, struggling families, pensioners, etc., hoovering it up to the already very wealthy. And it means that the any profits from energy stay in the community. You will see on any social media platform loads of posts saying that the countryside should be used to produce food. It shouldn't be used for solar farms. Solar farms are, an anomaly. They're industrialization of the countryside. Last week, I went to see a community-owned solar farm. And do you know what? It was beautiful. It was beautiful. It was serene. It was full of wildflowers. It was buzzing with bees. The soil is recovering. It's very, very positive for nature. It's still owned by a farmer. And once all of the work on the site is completed, because they've just got the next stage, is they're going to put a community-owned battery in there, which means that they're absolutely going to get the maximum energy out of this site. Once that's done, he's still going to be grazing sheep on there. So this is a site which is good for nature. It's generating renewable energy, and it's still going to be producing some food. But any social media platform that you're on, you will see loads of posts, which seem to be from concerned citizens that love our countryside. They're oil and gas generated, because they don't want that, because that's their nightmare. If communities can generate their energy, that's not money going to these companies anymore. So that's why we are struggling to change, because we're still basically in a society that's dominated by the people who are profiting from extracting from our communities. And they're terrified of this.
So I think there's a really important point there. Well, there's a number of important points there, but there's two things that I think are really interesting. One of which is the misunderstanding about the potential for something like agrisolar. So when you combine two different solutions in one way, and you have multiple benefits that are for food, for energy, for health of soil, for carbon sequestration. But at the same time, the other point that really stood out to me is this question of the difference between a trillionaire, a billionaire, and a millionaire. Because, Gosbert, I want to bring you in here, because with investment, with startups, with innovation, people, yes, they want to do good, but a lot of the time they also want to make money. And that's a good thing, because that's one of the things that drives people to make change. So it's about really having a conversation about when is enough, what is responsible. But can you tell me what you think from the perspective of an investor and someone who works with startups, why we have such problems with change?
Yeah, I think, we have problems. I think the system that we live in or at present is designed for stability. And for those who have perhaps got backgrounds outside of the UK, especially in the global south, they'll know this intimately. Things cannot be relied upon. And, that issue of stability is the same issue with kind of startups and capital deployment. I started my career, I guess, working with people building early stage ideas, taking initial risk. 2017, I was part of that wave where a lot of government funding was pumped into the production of lithium batteries. That was the future in 2016 and 17. Ironically, now in 2026, that market has largely collapsed. The belief was that we'd onshore battery production in the UK. How naive does that seem 10 years later? But at the back then, it was seen as the future. And I think that when we talk about stability, and I think I link that with inflexibility, and I think that's in humans too. A belief in orthodoxy, that things that you can count on. And being now an investor, I am beholden to our investors. There are rules around capital. I had to learn this, Capital moves and behaves in certain ways. If you work in wealth management or any parallel sectors, you'll know this. Coming from perhaps where I came from, my background, I didn't actually understand this before we raised the fund. So I think, and I can relate that to humans. I think, when it comes to change, embracing risk, I think that we build for stability and certainty. That runs often counter to the world that we're living in. And we can see this in modern day, and it's reflected in our politics. The dissatisfaction we have with a system that doesn't bend easily and is slow to change. And I think there's human nature in the way we look at change and how quickly we move towards it as well.
That's brilliant, and actually brings me to a later question I was going to ask, but I think it fits here better. Because when you talk about building for stability, I mean, one of the things that's a key part of thinking about things in systems is uncertainty and flexibility. But what assumptions do you all think we have as a society that are why we don't think we can change? One of them is obviously the individual believing they can make no difference and therefore assuming there's no point. But are there assumptions that you think exist within governance, within finance, within wider society that we should really address? I suppose what I'm asking is, what assumptions do we get wrong and why do they matter? Who wants to take that question first?
I'm happy to go in with the whole basis of our assessment of whether or not our economy is working now, which is the old GDP, which is, a metric that was never intended to be used in the way that it is used. And when you actually look into it, it's total nonsense. A house gets burnt down and gets built again. That's GDP. A house remains standing and it's functioning absolutely fine, not contributing to GDP at all. So it's a ridiculous measure and it's leading us in the wrong direction. The classic example is the bike. Bike is rubbish for GDP because, you've got a bike and you're cycling around, you're not maintaining your car, you're not filling it with petrol, you're basically not paying out for insurance, all of these kind of things. You're not basically probably needing as much, health services, etc. So all of those things are things which add up to GDP, which are not in there. So that's the whole basis upon which we are still assessing the value of our society, and we still haven't found a way around it. So people talk about it, but in what other metric, what other business, if you ran a business, and of course economy is not like a business, but you wouldn't just look at, turnover is sanity. Turnover is vanity, profit is sanity. And then you have a balance sheet. Your balance sheet matters, but we're not worrying about our balance sheet. So one of the things that I learned that just still blows my mind. So at Patriotic Millionaires, I do quite a bit of media for them, and we have our stats that come out. So the Sunday Times Rich List is a time in which we do some media. And when I last was doing that, the stat that I still can't get my head around was that when the Sunday Times Rich List started, which must be about 37 years ago, because it was 35 when I looked at it, net assets of the UK, so this is the net, what we had in terms of assets, less our liabilities, etc., was something like, and I might not have this figure exactly right, something like 670 billion or something like that. So we were very much in the black, right? And then by the time I was looking at it, we were $1 trillion in debt. Okay. And during that time, the wealth because we always look at the wealth of the 200 richest families, their wealth had gone up like multiple times. So there was a very clear illustration of where the money's gone. And why has that happened? Because during that period of time, we've had massive privatization, massive sell-off of council houses, things, so when we've had these privatizations, we think of, like the water companies, that's the clearest example, we now got shit in our rivers, etc. That's because of that. But when they sold it off, they also sold off loads of land that everybody owned. That was sold off. We've sold off buildings. We've sold off all of these things. Imagine you doing that as a family. You sell off your house, just so that you can go on more holidays, etc. It would be bonkers, wouldn't it? But that's what we've done as a nation. And so I think we are just basically looking at the wrong thing. We've been looking at the wrong thing for a long time. It's benefited those people at the top, and those are the people at the top that basically get listened to.
I think one thing that comes out of that is when you're thinking about GDP and its lack of usefulness. I saw a stat, and if I can find the report, I'll add it to the show notes, which said that 80% of the value that's been generated in the UK economy over the last 20 years has gone to the financial industry because it is very, very extractive. But one of the things that comes alongside concern about GDP being an assumption we shouldn't be using is the question of whether we're valuing things in the right way. And Harald, I was thinking about your work on the triple dividend, Is the way we value things part of the problem?
I think as a first comment to what you just said and what we've just heard is that we do know that we have an economy that's very much tilted towards financial services, the financial services industry, and that a new industrial policy or an economic policy that puts resilience at its heart, resilience in key industries and services, tries to maybe address that to an extent. Of course, it also wants to do that within financial services and banking, but going much beyond. I would make 3 points, and one of them is the triple dividend that you've just raised. The first is, we do have, and we all are aware of that, very short-termist thinking in policy making and investment decisions. This is what Mark Carney called the tragedy of the horizons when he was still the governor of the Bank of England. Of course, now he's the Prime Minister of Canada. But that was a key moment of introducing that into the conversation, short-termist thinking as opposed to the long-term perspectives we need of investment and planning when it comes to adaptation and resilience building. And the second is taking a much broader approach to understanding the benefits and opportunities that come through effective adaptation and resilience building. That is the work that you've just referred to, Fee, that we've done with the World Resources Institute, the World Bank and others around the triple dividend of resilience, where it's not just about thinking through losses, GDP, impacts, damages from climate disasters, from floods and storms and wildfires and all that, but taking a much broader approach to understanding, yes, economic, but also environmental and social benefits, to try and see where they fall, who benefits, and how can we bring those in that ought to be paying, rather than just, public investment, private actors. So it does require a much broader understanding and conceptualization of what we might call cost-benefit analysis, but we don't want to use it in the old traditional way. We want to expand that and change our thinking. And the third is, and I think that's really important, it's that government and maybe a private sector and others have for a long time thought of resilience and adaptation as something extra. And it really needs to be part and parcel of every core function of government. You build climate risk and resilience into everything that ministries of finance and planning and line ministries do, as well as private actors do. It's not something we do on top of everything else. It's at the heart and the core of everything we do and the way we build a resilient economy that works for everyone. And that perhaps takes a sort of a different approach than the more established GDP approach that we've just heard about. And I think that's important to me as a third point.
Okay. So, Gosbert, do you have any thoughts on which assumptions you think we're getting wrong before we move on to chatting about resilience?
People to self-organize is often underrated. There was many years ago I worked with, it's worth a read, Hilary Cottam. She wrote a book called Radical Help. Yeah. And I had a pleasure of working on some of the content of that book. I worked on the employment projects, which are described in that book. And the idea was not looking at employment as a transaction. The job center, for example, is a great example. It meets a need, get a job, when in fact it doesn't build a community. I spent 6 months seconded into Lewisham Job Center. And it was fascinating. Got to learn about what the advisors actually do beyond just helping people find work. They're actually helping young people who are more than 120 days out of employment. They know that 120 days, for example, means there's problems, aside from just your inability to get a job. But those departments don't talk to each other, so people end up in this swirling loop of government services. Now, the point about that is, I think we underestimate that, people's ability to self-organize. I think COVID exposed some of this. It gave us a chance, communities to come together. I think we make the assumption of ownership over stewardship. I've just moved out of London to a small town in Essex. It's fascinating to see how town councils actually operate and the pressures between those who say we need houses, I'm in the Greenbelt, and those who say, no, the house is my asset and I've worked for it and I don't want the asset price to fall. And these aren't millionaires. These are people who've done the honest thing, in inverted commas. They've worked. It was eye-opening to me to see this pressure played out where people were saying, no, we don't want new houses here, build them somewhere else. I know it's labeled as NIMBYism, boomers, et cetera, but to see that in a very human way. So I think, firstly, self-organizing, communities self-organize, and steward, the idea that humans need to own, that there isn't an in-between, and I think there's examples of even less than a mile from around here. I think I was over in Somerstown the other week to go see how food banks operate, how this amazing food banks is an organization called Life After Hummus. It's worth checking out their website. They're not just, they started more than 10 years ago, and they were just doing healthy eating or training around healthy eating for some of their residents. It's now transformed into a community benefit organization. They do surveys on retrofitting because they're fighting at Camden Council. They provide food banks and provide back to work training. This is largely self-organized and self-funded and scrapped together. I think I'm not trying to say you can replicate that model everywhere, but I think we underestimate the ability of community people to care. You know, where I live right now, if you're a homeowner, you care. If you're renting, you don't. That's the paradigm, you know, and it filters through. My WhatsApp group is going crazy right now. Someone's complaining about bins, and there's always this kind of, you know, but it's always this paradigm. Humans need to own. If we don't own, there's nothing else, you know.
Would it be all right if I come in on that?
Yes.
Yes, because that's so interesting. Yeah,
but I definitely did want to add that what you're talking about with the job centre and the difference between how it's seen and what it does is about the value in the relationship, not the transaction. And I'm definitely going to add some stuff to Hilary Gossam's work because it's brilliant. Sorry, after you.
To come in on that. So, just a couple of little stories, because that's all I can really tell you about my experience. So when I basically had some money to do something, it coincided with a State of Nature report coming out that's showing that nature in the UK is like, we think we're animal lovers, but we've got the worst nature bit basically in the world. We're always criticising other people about what they do. We've wiped everything out here. So that's when people started to talk about rewilding a bit more, and I immediately thought, well, okay, I can just get some land and I can just let it restore to nature. But I very quickly thought, well, I don't need to own that land. So what I decided to do is I basically started a project which I call Funding Nature, where I provide, and a group of other people come in with me, and we provide loans so that charities and community groups can buy land, because I think that unfortunately, we can't trust our government to own land, because it's always wanting to sell everything off. It wanted to sell all our forests off not that long ago. So the best we can do is our charities, and we have lots of wonderful charities, you know, that can look after that land. So I didn't need to own it. I helped buy the first one, and then I've helped with multiple. And I've got all the joy out of helping put that land into basically community ownership without any of the hassle. So I talk about this a lot, because there are a lot of people that have money and they think, no, they want to own it and they want to own that land. Some of them then come to regret it because they've also got all the hassle of it. But why do they need to own it? You know, because what they want, because a lot of them are doing it from the point of view of restoring nature, you don't need to do it. And the other thing I want to say in terms of community ownership, because I've started out, I've basically done lots of things, made lots of potentially mistakes, but I'm not sure the mistakes, because like you said, you've got to kind of invest in these things to know whether or not they work, and some work, some don't. But where I've now decided that the safest way to achieve impact now is community energy, and that is community ownership.
Come back to Harald, who I know wants to say something. I do think we do have to flag two things, which is the trade-offs you're talking about in terms of the local council between people who want to protect green and people who want to protect their assets, and the fact that there is a degree of privilege, I think, that comes with talking about climate and climate action, that for a lot of people, the kinds of choices that they have in front of them don't enable them to get involved in that way. And while we all know that, I think it's something that doesn't come up in the conversation often enough. Sorry, Harold, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to take that idea of ownership and agency to government work, because that's what I do. And for the last 2 years, I worked in DEFRA also on the economics of climate adaptation. Lots of people in DEFRA doing brilliant work, and also in the Environment Agency and DESNES and some of those key ministries that are tasked with addressing climate mitigation, adaptation, resilience building. But I think the core of the work we do through the RAMP program is to move this into conversations with ministries of finance and planning, because we want them to also understand that they have ownership and agency in these discussions. It is not something that DEFRA does only, although it has the coordinating function for the UK government for climate issues, but it's something that core ministries need to be concerned with and need to be pushing very hard as an agenda, and understand that it is within their remit to also take action. That's why we work with ministries of finance, with treasuries, ministries of planning and others, so that it can be an integrated systemic answer to a systemic challenge. So its agency across the board extends to local government as well. And in many cases where they have control over budgets, where they have control over planning, and so that's the sort of a more integrated approach we need to be taking. It's difficult to do, to bring all these people on board and to coordinate across all these actors and make them see how their interests are at stake and why they should be involved. But it's something we need to work on.
It's very clear to me that there are similar challenges, whatever scale you're actually creating an intervention at, whether it's governmental, local, investment, ordinary person. That is, I think, one of the challenges, that we have this idea that there is a solution rather than okay, there's lots of different problems. They interconnect in different ways. There's lots of different solutions. Maybe some of them work together. Maybe some of them don't. Again, that idea of making sure that you're thinking about the trade-offs in front of you and making a decision that works for the best, although obviously there's a huge argument about who decides what's best and how that's defined. But then that brings me to my next question, which is we're talking this week about resilience. But if we want to organize all these different people, all these different actors, all these different institutions, we have to agree on what an end goal is. And I don't mean a target that can be interpreted in different ways. So what I would love to know next is, if we're talking about the importance of resilience, what does that mean to you? Gosbert, I'll start with you.
It's changed recently. I would have said, resilience is the ability to withstand change and uncertainty. And I would have said bounce back. But the problem about bouncing back is you can't return to the old world. And I think that's part of the challenges of resilience now. I would almost argue there's a step before to define as much as possible, what are we taking on? As a bit of a sidetrack, a great example is, policy. When I was 11 years old, there was a new Labour government. I was 12 years old, 1997. Yes, I was 11. Anyway, sorry. And I was thinking about this. That Labour government, it was probably a Tory policy, but they promised at the time was 50% of all children will benefit from higher education. So more children would go to institutions like SOAS. That was admirable. There were problems in that great, which I benefited from as I became an adult. University was expanded. I got a great education. In 2026, we have problems I can see in my nephew who's 18, was that now university, the cost is astronomical, but also people are now saying, oh, you don't really need to go. There's too many degrees now. It wasn't that the public policy was rubbish. It wasn't. And there were warning signs. And I think when it comes to resilience, this idea of, withstanding change, I think it's important to define maybe at high level, have a detail, like, what are we returning to? The ability to withstand change and almost redefine the new. And I think that's how I would maybe redefine resilience now.
There's some really interesting work done by the Stockholm Resilience Institute, I think, where they actually talk about bouncing forward and trying to define that in a different way, which I like. Julia, any thoughts?
I'm sorry to think of this in very practical terms. So I just think, what do we need? And so my focus is on getting what we need into the hands of communities, because what we need, resilience, I think, is diversity in terms of diversity of ownership and control. So, if you look at our food systems, there are a handful of major, massive, ridiculous corporations that control most food, basically, most food that people rely on. And so George Monbiot talks about this really well. I think it's in Regenesis, about how unresilient we are, because you have resilience when you have lots of different sort of things that you're relying on. Because if you're just relying on a small number of systems and that goes down, or that it's exploitative, then everyone is screwed, basically. And that's where we are at the moment. We have this very, very exploitative food system, whether it's nature you care about, or whether it's basically the people of West Africa who basically have their primary food source now, which is fishing, being exploited so that people can eat smoked salmon as if it's just an everyday thing that you have in your sandwiches. Whereas when I was a kid, someone posh might have had that at a wedding, but people were not having smoked salmon in their sandwiches on a Monday. But they're now having that because the primary food source of some people is being taken to feed that in an incredibly inefficient way. What an inefficient way to generate food. But that's where we are. So what do we need? We need food, we need homes, we need energy. And, we need access to sort of community spaces and all of these kind of things. So that's my focus, very practical. How do we get that into the hands of communities, out of people who are running these things, just extractive for profit? We've seen where that ends up. We've got the greatest examples in our water companies, but look at all of our public services have now been put in that way, whether it's caring for the old or vulnerable kids. Yeah. Basically, we now have the people that are being paid are the people who are working out to make the greatest profit by paying the people who actually do the work as little as possible.
Well, this actually connects quite strongly to this idea of valuing the wrong things, because one of the reasons resilience often doesn't get valued properly is you can't monetize something that hasn't happened. If you can't monetize it, you haven't got a revenue stream. If you haven't got a revenue stream, you can't make it bankable for an investment. But sorry, Harald, your thoughts on resilience?
I think that the relationship between resilience and adaptation sort of nicely illustrates that. We pursue adaptation to understand withstand, build, adaptive capacity to shocks, to climate shocks and impacts, right? To floods and storms and wildfires and all this. But a resilience question is much more of a systemic question than adaptation. It needs to be across different sectors, not just for that particular problem that we're trying to protect against or that particular climate impact, but needs to include all the different actors that we've spoken to earlier. So building resilience is also changing systems and making systems fit for the delivery of future.
I'm going to interrupt you because I completely agree with you that building resilience is a systemic issue and we all need to take our own part, be you government, actor, institution. But before you build resilience, how are you defining resilience? Because that's the thing I keep coming back to. Is it adaptation? Is it bouncing back? Is it bouncing forward? Or is it something else? Well, no, I mean, because I do think one of the challenges when we're talking about the lack of coordination is that we haven't yet agreed on what it is we're trying to achieve. So when you're talking about the importance of building resilience, what do you mean in terms of what we're building towards?
I mean, sorry, you go ahead. I mean, I don't mind coming in on that because I just don't think it's a complicated question. Because, you walk around this city at the moment and you notice the difference in temperatures when you're walking down a street that's got no trees and then you walk under some trees. You will feel the temperature will drop. You'll feel a little gentle breeze. And that's resilience. So having, so having basically people living in areas without trees, that's complete lack of basically livable spaces now. Because we know that trees offer so very much. So basically people living in places where they have trees, that's basic resilience. Very basic resilience now is sponge cities. So having somewhere where the water goes. So not allowing this situation where everything's just being slapped over. That's lack of resilience. Resilience is, and I think Paris have been doing a really good job on some of this stuff, haven't they? So there's lots of examples of people that are building resilience.
But I suppose this is what I'm trying to get to. We know it when we see it, and we know it when we feel it. But in the world in which we live, the current system we operate under, we need to have a theory, an approach, a solution, a governance concept. And that really is what I mean by a definition. And I don't have one, which is why I was hoping you guys would.
I don't think we have a one sentence definition or just a few words. I think that's possible. I think just in response to what we've just heard, I would probably say that the direct impact is more of an adaptation impact than resilience. If we have people shielded from heat and temperatures drop, then they're better adapted or well adapted. I think resilience also means that all of that is integrated with urban planning, that are the people who are organizing these spaces, who are responsible for planting and maintaining trees, for doing all of those things, work together to maintain the system, delivering those benefits, right? The eventual outputs that individual people benefit from, that also needs to be, that whole shebang needs to come alongside the actual impact on the ground. And that would be resilience, to have a system that responds well to these challenges and is, as you said earlier, forward looking. It's all of the above of what you just said earlier. It's all of the above, but you can't really capture that in just a one. And I would reject that we always have to oversimplify. It's not a simple issue. It's complex. We can explain it in a few sentences, but maybe not just in 3 or 4 words. Yeah.
No, and that's fair enough. But actually, this brings me to what I think is at the heart of the challenge of coordinating action on building resilience, on dealing with these things, which is that it is really complex. And we talk about climate and climate impacts as a scientific issue or a technological challenge, but coordination is a human problem. So, what are we doing about the problems of public trust? Because even the best solutions, they need the public to trust that this is something that isn't going to cause them a problem. So I suppose I was going to ask how important is social cohesion in achieving resilience, but I kind of think that's another one of those ones which is like, yes. But how do we get that in a world that's increasingly polarized and everyone's getting information from different places and we're not sure we share the same information environment?
So if I can just come on that, so we have got a massive problem now about who's gateposting what information people get. And of course, my mate Elon Musk, he bought Twitter for a particular reason and he achieved some good results for him. He got Trump in. He basically is now sort of, basically just got rid of our prime minister. He was instrumental in that. Whatever you think of Keir Starmer, basically that's not a great result for democracy, because we basically have someone, the soon-to-be trillionaire, basically, for his own ends, getting rid of our prime minister. So there's a couple of things here. How we achieve this is one of the biggest problems here is that we don't pay for what we need in society. So the people who are providing what we actually need in society are paid the least, our carers, the people who are keeping our streets clean, the people who are, looking after people in our hospitals, they are paid the least. We pay the most to the people who are working on extracting profit from the people that are doing the work. So we can only address that through basically tax, that boring old subject of tax. We can only address this and actually achieve resilience, because resilience requires, as you said, people to look after those trees, people to, do all this kind of stuff. That ain't going to be done by business. That has got to be done at a state level. It's got to be organised at a state level. You can only pay for that if we now access where all the money is, and the money is now in wealth.
So I'm going to ask a question about that, because one of the things that is very obvious at the moment is that we suck at collective action. You mentioned the importance of building community energy because it is a way to get community together and build things. But generally speaking, we tend to fight each other, or people who suggest collective action are accused of being lefty, or, how do we change people's perspective? Because it's one thing to say, yes, we know the one way to solve this problem is taxation, because we have structured how we pay people for what they do in the wrong way. Well, okay, if you accept that as a baseline, how do you persuade everybody else, everyone in the world who's frightened that their taxes are going to go up, that that's the thing to do?
So you say that everybody is against this collective action and they are basically, they point us out as progressive. I don't agree with you. I think we think that because of the way social media works. Don't forget, most of those people that are saying that, they are not people. They're just bots, basically. They're paid for by my mate Musk and all of his mates. So this is the problem, how we get beyond that. So a really brilliant example of how some people are getting, two brothers basically have been getting beyond that is, I don't know if any of you have yet seen the People's Emergency Briefing. If you haven't, you should. So there should be screenings of it going on in wherever it is you live. If there aren't, then you can arrange that yourself. And that the specific purpose of that is getting past those algorithms. So I helped to hold one recently down in Poole, which is where I live. And we specifically didn't want wasn't interested in people coming from the local Friends of the Earth group or the local Greenpeace group or anything like that. What we wanted is representatives of local businesses and organisations, and we wanted them to come and see it and then hopefully hold their own screenings. And we did really well, actually. We had about 55 organisations represented, and that's just in one area. So we do have to have different ways. Another example of why I don't agree with you. So we're constantly told that if you increase taxation on wealth, all the wealthy people will go abroad. Well, to be honest, wealthy people have been going abroad for a very, very long time. They make their money, they bugger off to Marbella, or now it's Dubai and all of these kind of places. But now, whenever they do that, we will have certain people that will tell us they're going because they're worried about wealth taxation. Well, we do regularly, we do polls, and those polls show that 75% of millionaires support wealth taxes. They show that people understand that if you want to live in a country where you're not worried about your kids walking out at night and going out at night, you have to fund that. So, but we're constantly told the otherwise, because we have this misinformation that's going out there.
Dad, I've just remembered something. I was watching a podcast which had some American billionaires on it, and one of them actually said they were going to have to start having conversations about social benefit because otherwise people might rise up. And I thought, that's language I haven't heard outside of a university lecture hall in a long time.
I agree with the points you're making there, because I think there's a bit of a journey to be taken as a collective. I wasn't there, but I've been reading a lot about Margaret Thatcher. I was born in 86. I have no memory of her. But, for how unpopular she's been portrayed, how did she win 3 elections? I've always wondered. She won back-to-back elections. So how did she do it if she was so unpopular? And, there's a big debate around kind of sovereign wealth funds connected to that. And everyone says that, I'm sure you've heard this, the UK had an oil boom, unlike Norway, I generally don't like comparisons between countries because you can't really compare them like I like, but it's useful in some senses. Unlike Norway, why did the UK not build a sovereign wealth fund? Obviously, Norway has one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world. Why didn't we save some of the oil revenue? Where did it go? And that, you look, on face value, you look at it and think, wow, we really wasted an opportunity there. But if you look at the context, and I wasn't there, I've only read it through books and media, the context of the UK in the early 80s and what Thatcher came into and the message she delivered, it's a bit like looking at Brexit and thinking it was just 10 years to the day, today, by the way, and thinking that Brexit was just people angry at Europe. No, there was a context. If you look at what actually happened, what was going on in 2016, and seeing how the Brexit vote was about, not all, a lot of people want to kick something, kick the system, and they delivered one hell of a kicking. Sunderland was listened to, Great Yarmouth was listened to, and I think it's important that to seize the moment. And I think right now is that there's a bit of an opportunity here for a bit of a reset, and it's about taking people on a journey around wealth. Most people complain about wealth taxes and millionaires running away. Generally, it's not coming from millionaires. My WhatsApp groups, some of them are full of people, taxes going up,
Is it people worrying that if they became millionaires, surprisingly, it might be taken away from them?
Classics. There's stereotypes, which I won't go into, but there's a lot of that relative. A lot of not necessarily I'm wealthy, but when I get there and when I honestly do the work and I get to the top, then someone's going to take it away. Fair play, that idea, it's aspirational as opposed to the people who have got wealth seemingly, okay, yeah, tax us more, but it's that aspiration, the idea of a ladder. It's the same with home ownership, that idea that I can save a deposit and buy a home. It's fair. I take the steps. But to hear, when people feel locked out, then you get backlash. And I think there's something in the mix when it comes to wealth taxes, that journey, not a kind of, it's sold as kind of work hard, the government takes it, which is ridiculous.
Yeah. And I think there is something really interesting about the governance issue, because we've got so much change happening and climate change is happening way too fast. We've got AI technologies, we've got all sorts of new energy technologies. Do you think the issue potentially is partly because our governance systems just can't keep up with how fast everything is changing? Harold, you got any thoughts on that?
Possibly. Yes, there's a lot of challenges, a lot of changes. I would come back to the point I made earlier, which is that there is actually rather a good awareness across ministries, across government, across departments, that needs to be integrated better. There are always clusters of people and experts in units that understand particular challenges well. And we have to have a division of labor to an extent. Not every department can do everything. That's why we have different government departments and ministries to deal with different issues, and line ministries to work into Treasury and others. But to connect up those groups more effectively, to bring that knowledge as to what the risks and problems are, what the solutions potentially are, I would argue that does exist in many quarters already. It needs to be connected. It needs to be connected. That's not to say that it exists everywhere. Of course, we do need some better understanding and tools and responses, or just funding. We're looking beyond the UK into other country contexts, absolutely. But it is also about doing this, as we often say when it comes to policy. Removing that from the climate conversation for a moment, that it is not always about new policy rules and regulation, but actually implementing what we have effectively and making sure we close gaps and loopholes effectively, as opposed to having to rewrite. Of course, sometimes it is. Sometimes we do need to make more dramatic changes, but often it is also about that. And understanding how we can do that better is part of the solution.
Can I just say I really love hearing that, because I was talking to someone who's building an AI tool to look at the interaction of laws, and I think found 20,000 different European laws that touch on, are affected by, that impact on other laws, all relating to one particular problem. And you just think that's not possible. That's too much. But often laws don't get removed or updated, and they're covered by something else. So this really, if we're talking about governance and funding and where that goes, and we're talking about the problems of the trade-offs and people's fear that things will be taken away from them, part of that raises for me the fact that this is clearly, sorry, I shouldn't say this is clearly, because it may not clearly be, it might just be my opinion, but the financial system is structured in a way that perhaps is not necessarily aligned with a resilient future. So I would ask you your opinion. What do you think today's financial system encourages? What do you think it discourages? And why do you think it matters?
Well, I'll go in there. I think we know what it encourages. It encourages short-termism. It encourages extraction, profit at the expense of anyone else, because it does not take into account, one, it takes absolutely no account of the impact on the natural world, takes absolutely no account of impact on those exploited during the system. But I just want to tell, just in terms of, I feel like we're winding up. So there's a couple of things just to get in there. So I've invested in lots of companies, many of which have failed. And I would say that they failed because they were trying to change a system which corporates didn't want change, particularly in terms of trying to move from single use into reuse. Basically the corporates make lots and lots of money from producing stuff that's then disposed, and they don't care about any of that. One company that is still standing, which I love, and it's got a different governance structure, is the Library of Things. So you might have heard about them. So they have this stewardship. So they weren't going for making lots of money. They're very clear from the beginning, you're not going to make 10x on this. They are just going for something very, very different. And all of those ones that were basically getting pushed along to, yes, you've got to go faster on this, you've got to do all this, they've gone, they failed. So one is, we can do this differently. There are people that are trying to do this differently. In terms of how we start explaining to people about how this sort of, protection of the wealthy from being taxed, you might think you're going to get there, but you're not really. Most people, 99.999% of people, not going to be in a position where you're going to be affected by the kind of taxation of wealth that we're talking about. The guy that explains that really, really well, and hopefully you already know and have seen some of his stuff, is Gary Stevenson. He explains it so much better than me, and he's really brilliant, and he's getting people listen to him that, don't really, that would never listen to an economist, would sort of, that are being, basically fed this information by people who don't want anyone questioning this. And of course, the result of us not taxing wealth is that we are currently increasing taxation of work. We put up that tax on employers' NI, and you might say it's on the employer, but that's going to be less jobs. So that's been, we've got a government that says they're pro-workers. Well, it's all very well being pro-workers if there's some bloody people in jobs, but a lot of people can't be employed now.
Again, this comes back to the decisions that you make and understanding consequences it has somewhere else.
Yeah. And just very quickly, in case I don't get a chance to speak again, please do have a look at that People's Emergency Briefing. Just look up National Emergency Briefing, People's Emergency Briefing. And I don't think that you will be disappointed in how good that is and how helpful it will be to get that shown in your communities.
Harold, any final thoughts? No? Gosbert?
Just from our perspective at Future Impact Ventures, obviously we operate a venture fund. I'll give you a sneak preview. We've actually secured our main investor. There'll be a press out which will go out tomorrow. And, just this journey of even getting here has been arduous. But I guess to touch upon the idea of financial system, we are part of a financial system. There are rules, as I said, to capital. The incentives when operating a venture fund are short term. We have 5, maybe 6 at most years to get back our investment at a multiple. Yeah, we could take 10, but in realistic, if you're taking 10, you're not getting a second fund. There are very human incentives which are at work. Now, in our impact metrics, we've advocated for data to be shared upon the socioeconomic background of those we invest in. Now, we have been discouraged in doing that. People have said off record, I wouldn't do that if I were you. But why? Why? Because it tells a bad story. If you were to take 100 investments across the UK and see where did the people that raised that investment, what school did they go to? Was it a fee-paying school? Were your parents university educated? What it will probably tell is that the most privileged in society generally raise venture capital. And those that aren't from that background are outliers. And that's kind of embarrassing if we base a system upon the idea of meritocracy. But at all levels, I guess we're kind of complicit. We have 5 to 6 years to get our investments out. We need winners. I hate that term because, tech bros define what a winner is, right? High growth, growth at all costs. I met Library of Things in 2013, before there was a sharing economy. I remember people looked at them and was like, yeah, people are going to loan things? Like, there was no sharing economy. There were no platforms. They were doing this early. And I'm so proud that they not just survived, but also thrived. But the idea of short-termism, it's built into everything. The good thing is, I would say this just to wrap, there are shoots of hope. So, for example, one of our major investors, the British Business Bank, for the first time is committing to smaller funds. it's not got the same kind of allocation rules that a fund 5 years ago. We're having more discussions around background, having more women general partners in the fund industry. That it's happening, but it's happening very, very slowly. But it's there, and it does give me hopes. But I do recognize the system we are part of, returns, and, pension funds are complicit too. The whole capital stack is tied to this, and, change is coming, but as I said, it's slow.
Thank you for that. Now, I do have one final question before we open the floor to questions. And before I do ask this final question, I will say I really didn't get through many of my questions. There's so many different things that you have to think about when you're exploring what actually making action happen means. But having not got through my questions, I will ask all three of you, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you think is core to this conversation that we should have touched on? Because I'll do another podcast about it another time.
Gosh, I'm not normally stuck for words, but there's so many things that I could talk about. So let's just talk about startup companies then, and just how at the moment, it's all about AI. It's all about AI. Yeah. Of course, AI can do something. But what's so depressing is that the people, so I've invested in companies that are doing things that were really, really needed. And just one after another, they failed. And I'll just tell you some of the examples of why they failed then. So, Good Club, Dizzy, which we're trying to do reusable grocery packaging. They did real research into it. They really looked into what could be a system to move away from that. Ultimately, how they failed was they were sort of pushed into pursuing what was posed as going to be a really big contract with one of our major supermarkets, spent all of their efforts on that because it was pivotal. It could have really achieved systemic change. Around that time, there was a lot of talk about that the government was going to bring in, so extended producer responsibility, all of this kind of stuff was coming on, it was happening. All of that stuff's been pushed down the line. After them basically putting all of their eggs in that basket, that major supermarket just went, no, we're not going there. So they just went down because they pushed so much in it. Another one. This is one that's very raw. So you will know what can happen is that, so this is a company that's doing fantastic work. We're doing fantastic work, basically retrofitting diesel buses to electric. They have been struggling along for a very long time. Some issues, but they were trying to do, this is really, really major because basically we're still producing diesel buses. We're still putting diesel buses out there. London right now, that's the last thing you want on your streets is more diesel buses. So really, really good. But, if you've got, a diesel bus, which is relatively new, you can't just go replacing that with electric because they've got like 14-year, whatever lifespans and that kind of thing. Doing really great stuff. Supposedly, again, going to be getting a major contract in from a local authority, but that dragged on and on and on. It was never, ever getting there because it never got to the top of the pile. Basically, their financial situation is getting more and more difficult. They'd had some investment from another company, and basically, they were pushed to the wall, and then they've been scooped up by a large company. And probably that technology is going to go out of the UK.
So, Julia, I'm actually going to sort of move on slightly, but I do think this is really interesting because what you're talking about is identifying the problems that you have to face when you're building a business and trying to understand when you make a decision, when you don't know what the future is and whether you should put all your eggs in one basket. Because I think it's very difficult to know how best to move forward when the future's uncertain.
It's also about, this government talks a lot about supporting
Every
companies.
government talks a lot.
And they're not. So multiple companies coming, and it's all very well, AI, it's going to come with great stuff, but we need really practical solutions. And the really practical solutions that, I've gone after, they have been allowed to fail because they're not going to necessarily make a load of money, but they're going to solve some really big problems. So we do still have a situation in Britain where we come up with great ideas and then we do not support those businesses to implement it and then keep that in the UK.
I think that actually is probably worthwhile, an entire discussion in and of itself. Gosbert, any final thoughts on what we should have touched on? Could have touched on?
I found myself in a weird kind of process because, weird space because, running a venture fund, you have all these ideas and great ambitions. And sometimes we joke and say, if you really want to make a difference, why don't we just fund schools better? Because there's often a discussion about diversity. Oh, we need more female business leaders. We need more minority business leaders. And then you're like, okay, well, how do we really of course we can invest, we can find. But the real heart of the issue lies further downstream from us. Sorry, further upstream. It's education, schools. My wife, for example, she has this bag she takes to school every single day. Box, and it's full of hair care products, toiletries, etc. I'm like, what's that box for? She's like, oh, it's called a get through the day box. I can't give this to the students, but I can leave it on my desk for students who are in temporary accommodation, unstable housing. And, she's in a school where it's 40%, it's high, and it's 5 miles from here. And I think, as great as, gosh, I feel like I'm biting the hand, that feeds me. As great as, the venture space is, I can see the limitations just through this conversation, that to mobilize a small amount of capital, relative on, but what you actually need is big systemic investment, and investing in stuff which doesn't bring returns in the next 5 to 10 years. It's long-term and societal.
Well, that actually brings me back to Harold and the triple dividend and how you actually look at changing the system from within. But is there anything I haven't asked you about that I should have done?
The point I'd like to add, based on what we just heard, and I think the whole conversation, is that the relationship, I think, that's important between public and private. And yes, it sometimes is operating within the confines of the system. We should also look to changing the system, of course. But a takeaway that has come from a number of different sessions we've had, London Climate Action Week and other conversations over the months and years, is that ministries of finance, core governmental departments, or government on the whole, has very powerful levers at its disposal. It can intervene and do a lot of things that it is currently not doing. So a takeaway that a lot of experts in this space consistently put on the table is be bolder, be more ambitious. Governments can be bolder and be more ambitious than they currently are when it comes to adaptation and resilience, and when it comes to pushing for a very particular course of action. Yes, in Treasury, but also in other line ministries. And I think it's this awareness that we have the ability to make change, but we're not really using that very effectively at this point in time. That's quite important to perhaps focus on, another time and discuss a little bit in a bit more detail.
And I do think these are very important points, because in the end, what we're really saying, I think, is that we are operating within a system that is not optimized for the benefit of the human, and that we need to be bolder and wilder in our ideas in order to change our approach to one of survival to one of thriving, which I think is great. And so I'm very grateful to you all for being here. But before I say goodbye, I'm turning to the audience. Do you have any questions for the panel?
Thanks. So in one of Harold's classes, we were talking about climate governance and the climate governance beyond the state. And we talked about the community-owned wind farms in Denmark, and we got stuck on the fact that can this model be transported to other countries where they can also follow suit. But the problem that we got stuck on was that population can be a constraint. Or is it also the land tenure, the financing structures, and the grid policies? What would you say the first thing a country like India can do to change these community ownerships so that it can be viable at scale, and rather than just decentralized energy access?
I'm not sure who that question was addressed towards. Oh, okay. So really trying to understand how we would go about scaling community intervention.
Yeah.
Especially when the financial structures are not the same, because I think there is an important point about policy, which is that we keep trying to find the optimum way of intervening, but every country is different.
Yeah.
Every geography is different. Every demographic is different. What do we think?
I mean, it's a really good question, because a lot of these community projects, the ones that really thrived have been those where they've had people with skills, so the ones that, you see that go really, really well are sort of Bristol and Oxford, and they've got a lot of people who are basically nearing retirement, and they've got skills, some great engineers, they'll have the accountants, the people, the lawyers and everything, and they've taken that forward. Now they do share what they're doing, so a great example of that is there's a guy who lives down in the West Country, and he helped set up Grimsby Community Energy, right, different ends of the country. And so they are sharing the expertise, and all of the expertise, because there's a lot of learning in terms of the governance, is shared through Community Energy England or Community Energy Scotland and that kind of thing. So there's that starting point. Of course, then I guess you need people within the countries who are able to achieve that. And it's all very well, that structure, but I think where it falls down is it relies on people having the privilege to be able to volunteer and do that work for free. And where we actually need to get to is where those people are able to be paid to do the work. And I guess the only way of doing that is having people that are willing to seed it and willing to take a lower return. So what my colleague Tim Stumpf and I are doing is we're trying to bring a lot more money into community energy. We're doing it within the UK because we're just a couple of people, we don't have the capacity to go outside of that. And we want to do that so that areas of the country, like Grimsby, which struggle they don't have so many people with lots of money that can do it as they do in other areas of the country, we can enable them to go faster. And what we're really trying to do is get our hands on places where there is lots of money and some intent to do well, but they will only do that through a fund structure. So, our absolute top target is Church of England and faith groups. They've got a lot of money. They have they stated aim that they want to invest some of that for impact. We could help them achieve impact if we can get their money directed into community energy, but we need to get a fund structure set up for that. We either kind of need some money from government or from someone to help us sort of make it work, because we can, to achieve what we want to achieve, we can only provide a very moderate financial return to the people who put their money in. And so it's kind of tying that up. So I think in other countries, you're going to need to access, because there is wealth in India, isn't there? You're going to need to access the wealth, and then you're going to have to need to sort of, use the learnings of elsewhere, but it's probably going to need to be in such a way that people can be paid to set them up from the start. So
I just had a really weird thought, and this is probably completely wrong, but could you give a tax break to people who invest in low return?
This is my laugh. So I worked out.
I just don't know enough about it.
Yeah. So what I worked out recently, SEOS and EIS, right? So this is basically, it's a tax incentive to invest in early stage companies. And basically they took that away from community energy. So, so you invest in community energy, energy generation, it took it away. And there was probably some justification at the time, because when they first brought in feed-in tariffs, which was basically sort of like this payment for renewables, it was just basically very wealthy people who had big stretches of land in Scotland. They were getting it all, weren't they? So they took that away from there. So it occurred to me that at the moment you could probably get a tax break for investing in a company that's making bow ties for chihuahuas, because that's my idea of the most ridiculous thing. You could probably get a tax break for that. You couldn't get it for putting solar on schools, for investing in solar on schools. Am I wrong on that?
I just add, we should definitely talk about, because I'm on the board of a trust which does community energy, and what I think something I've noticed, you have to build into the existing infrastructure. So in India, it may be the social innovation ecosystem, which is quite, Acumen do a lot of work in India. I think the first port of call is there, build into what you've already got. So how can we kind of fund, how can there be funding directed towards the establishment of projects within the current context of what India already does, as opposed to building it separate? 7 years ago or 8 years ago, when I was living in Exeter in the southwest, I felt that was the spiritual home of community energy. I got so many propositions. I remember working there at the time. None of them were necessarily commercial in a sense of clear returns, but they were doing good work. I think maybe less than a year ago, I saw my first ever venture capital proposition from a community energy company. It was Emergent Energy in Hackney. They put a lot of solar panels up on Hackney schools, a few miles from here. Full commercial, full returns, venture. And I was like, wow, that is taken. And this founder has been on the journey. He's a true believer, and he's come on that. And sometimes timing is, you need to buy time. You need enough time for people in the West Country to fiddle around with these opportunities. In Grimsby, you need to grow that before we can talk about maybe commercial propositions emerging.
So what we're basically saying, I think, in terms of scaling community energy, is you need capacity and skills. You need finance, especially priming the pump. You need awareness and knowledge of the potential. It needs to fit into existing infrastructure. You need to think about your timing, and I suppose you need to be lucky. What else?
You will need central government in some countries to give space to local communities and local government to do this kind of work, or communities to come together. So the subsidiarity or devolution principle to hand it down. And actually, when we look at what's been happening across the C40 or, the cities against climate change, local communities coming, there's a lot of examples of best practice from around the world of how that works in a number of different contexts that we can draw on. There is learning going on. It's not enough. But yes, it is also about providing that space from a regulatory perspective or from a devolution perspective. And then it's about, and that's a point you already raised, is giving fiscal space, right? So if these local communities or, be it municipalities or be it individual groups of citizens, they need to have the means to do that. So it's not just devolving the regulatory environment, but giving them fiscal autonomy to a degree.
And you also gave me an idea there when you mentioned physical space, which is we also need to give policymakers, politicians space to make these changes. And a huge part of that, and that we haven't talked about today, is how we communicate the need to do things most effectively and how we communicate the meaning of these different interventions, because for a lot of people, they don't mean anything. So how to make that a lived reality. But obviously that's not part of our conversation today. Sorry, are there any other questions?
I wanted to start by saying I both agree and disagree with some of the points you've just made about communities and returns. Actually, there's a lot of evidence that in many cases, communities make higher returns. Social enterprises tend to grow faster statistically than other SMEs. And also, there's only 2% of investment in female-led businesses, but they tend to grow much faster than all the other businesses. So a lot of this is assumptions about where the returns come from rather than the realities. I think that we have a problem with agency and with devolving agency, and we've touched on this, but I'd really like to go a lot further. And the assumption that we need to do a lot more work before we can do this. Actually, decades ago in Porto Alegre, there was participatory budgeting. People made different choices about where the money was spent. Increasingly, people and communities are looking at citizen assemblies. There was even an international citizen assembly for the COP in Glasgow, which included people from all over the world, including a shepherd from Afghanistan. So I really want to say, you actually said we underestimate communities' ability to organise themselves, including in some of the poorest parts of the world. We underestimate communities, and I'd love you just to speak to that a little bit.
Just pick up on one point, and I'll let the others speak on the broader issues you just raised. I participated in a conversation yesterday, or was in the audience, and the point that was raised is that in microfinance and lending, the evidence from the developing world we see is that men default on those loans 30% of the time, and women, I think, 2 or 3% of the time. It's a very small number in comparison. And so that spoke to the importance of gender and bringing in, women-led businesses and empowering them more in those spaces, because they are just, better pairs of hands to address some of these issues. So I think that's just to add to that, but I'm leaving
There's also something quite interesting, because I remember seeing some data which showed that generally speaking, in microfinance, the people who use microfinance don't default nearly at the high rates as people in the West do on their bank loans, because there's a different urgency and a different importance to what's being done. But guys, Julia.
Community organising is basically where I've ended up. So where I've invested in startup companies, they've failed. That's why I've ended up now focusing on community energy, because they don't. It's basically what I say, pretty immediate impact. It's basically very low risk. it's a moderate return, but it's a return, you know? Whereas all of these other ones, I mean, and I didn't invest in any of them to make money. But, you know, it's still when you lose that money, it's money you can't then put into other things. Whereas, you know, so community energy and these things which are, again, they're focusing on what we need. And I think they're very stable. So I think they're fantastic. And I don't actually think you do need market levels of return, because with any portfolio, if someone, you know, an institution or an individual, they will have some low level returns in there. They're generally from sort of quite complex sort of fund structures where what I call there's a lot of leakage. So there's a lot of leakage out to, you know, this fund management structure, this one, you know, because they have funds of funds of funds. Community energy, no leakage, because you're directly, I mean, yes, we are now talking about setting up a fund, but we're talking about setting up a fund which is basically we want to maintain just moderate returns and not offer more than moderate returns. It will add some cost to it, but it will bring in the kind of money which will not do what we do, which is very, very bitty. You know, the Church of England and big trusts, they would never do what we do. So we've got to have a bit of that. But we don't want to be offering higher levels of return, because I think there is still appetite to accept that, because it is such significant impact returns.
But I think it's also worth pointing out that for those people whose pensions are invested in the stock market in the current world, investment in something that makes return, even if it isn't very high, but is very resilient and has a continuous return, seems to be like a bit of a no-brainer.
Absolutely. And, you know, and a pension is protecting your future. If we don't do something about the climate, you haven't got a future. And, you know, people investing in their pensions, they're also parents and grandparents, you know, so when they are making those investments and there's nothing happening within those portfolios to protect the future of, you know, those that they care about or indeed themselves, it's not a good return on your investment, is it?
Yeah. Well, again, that comes back to the definition of return and how you look at value. Gosbert, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I wear two hats. I think I've got increasingly pragmatic as I've gotten older. You know, I understand anything you need wins. You need sometimes to make to bring the believers or to create believers. You need to be able to point at things and say, this is what happens when you follow me. At the same time, you need to think long term. So I've become very pragmatic. And to talk about communities, you know, I think it's worth really shining light on the work that others are doing. So, for example, the Pathways program, which is run by Asher Craig, who we're good friends with. You know, it's one of the first social funds dedicated to minoritized community and minority-led social enterprises, doing some really great work across the UK. They've been very intentional. I sat on the pilot about 2 years ago, and the problem we found, not that there was a lack of social enterprises across the UK doing a range of interesting things, from women's refuges in Leeds to we had community organizations up in Newcastle. The issue wasn't the lack of, you know, work. The issue was absorption of capital. Very practical, that we give you 50 grand. Can you actually absorb this 50 grand? And can we expect even the 50 grand back? And it was very kind of, and what we actually realized through that pilot was the problem isn't the lack of social. We actually need to create a structure, which Pathways have actually done recently. They launched their kind of, and they themselves, a great approach they've got isn't we're going to save everyone. No, it's we're going to work with intermediary organizations who already have trust in the communities. And we're going to fund them so they can go and do the work. A real kind of systems approach as opposed to we're going to control everything. So I think I wear kind of two hats. Great work's going on, but I also understand running a venture fund, there are limits on the types of things we can look at, because we are constrained to. One day we'll change the system, of course, but for now we operate with certain constraints.
One thing I do love about that is talking about the importance of the relationship, because I think this issue about trust is something that keeps coming up again and again and again. And historically, this used to be an issue talking about development finance, but actually what it boils down to is anything to do with money, anything to do with changing the way people think about things will boil down to trust. Right. Well, I think at this point it is... Sorry, was there another question?
Stan, thank you very much. Honestly, it's been scintillating conversation happening here. I did want to take a sort of tangent to this. You were talking about different ways you can measure impact, so bear that in mind with my question. And then I know the focus has been on community because it's safe, etc. But I'm imagining if you could double click on that and go into personal agency and just really using that as a way to lift. And here you're not counting the impact in terms of money you're getting back, but the change that it's doing. And the interesting models that are coming in now to test that about just direct cash, being given to people who need it and not being there to tell them how to use it. And that is uplifting villages. So I wonder where such conversations can come in terms of impact that you can drive, agency, that can come to individuals changing their communities and their villages.
So, it's definitely worth checking out the book Radical Help, because it touches upon this. And there's another book called Creating Capabilities. I can't remember the author's name. But the reason I mention that is because about 10 years ago, when I was working in the kind of social innovation space, we proposed a metric to the Department of Work and Pensions around, it was in the context of a person's employability. How do you measure that? Not whether they got a job, but their connections. We had a fluffy term. The more networked someone is, the easier they are to employ. The most employable people are the people with the widest networks. And that sounds so obvious, but 10, 12 years ago, we thought we had stumbled into something magical. We proposed that metric, like someone's ability to connect to the Department of Work and Pensions. And they laughed us out of the room. But obviously the context was, 2015. So it was kind of first Tory government work program, scroungers, that sort of language around people that weren't working. That was the context. And the Department of Work and Pensions at the time only cared about one metric: get people off benefits. And it trickled down from ministerial level to this bell they used to ring in the job center every time an advisor had moved a service user off of the benefits. That was ridiculous. But that was the system they were in. So in terms of kind of agency, I think you need a demonstrator, a practical demonstrator. We attempted this, a practical demonstrator, how that would work, but also how does it connect directly to what people care about now, or the system measures. So our connections, we never made the case of it connecting to moving people away from benefits. And that was, ironically now, the Department of Work and Pensions looks into this now, and it's there's great opportunity, but 10, 12 years ago, not at all. And I think, but if you can make that case, if there is a causal link there, I think there's an opportunity for things like agency to be included in impact metrics today.
Well, I think that's literally part of the whole conversation that has to be there, because it is actually making people feel they have the agency to do things differently and to make a difference. And I think probably this brings me back to my complete obsession with definitions and why I'm always looking for one, because if you have a goal, you have to understand what the shared definition is. And you can talk about getting people to work, but if the metric is getting them off benefits, that's a totally different definition of what you're trying to achieve. Any other thoughts?
Just to emphasize this individual agency aspect, not to provide an answer in a way, but to add on to what you've just said, is that when we talk about adaptation, resilience building, it is about understanding that a lot of adaptation is very context specific, is very localized. Sometimes they're larger interventions with flood protection and dams but often they're much smaller in scale. They need to be understood, operated, owned, run, supported by local communities, by individuals who will be part of maintaining, carrying this forward, their approach, their thinking, but also the infrastructure, the asset itself. So it's critically important to have that understanding that there is agency, that we need to be involved, we need to be part of this, rather than this is a bigger intervention only, which we usually see in the mitigation space. Although here too, you can have smaller scale solutions, and you should. So just to emphasize that point rather than wait on.
And I'm just going to add to that before I finish up, that I really love the fact that individual agency is becoming such an important part of the conversation, because we all know that one of the challenges in climate action was the work the fossil fuel industry did to turn around and make everything our responsibility. The idea that we have a carbon footprint and we're at fault for making the wrong choices. That was a very interesting piece of work, but the opportunity to turn that around and say, okay, it's not about making the right choices in terms of what I eat and where I fly, but about how I choose to engage, about what I choose to support, and about the conversations I choose to have. Right. Any last words from any of you?
I've got to respond on that because it's both. Because there are far too many people that think that you can, because you're engaging, because you're doing things, you don't then have to, and particularly people with wealth. they think that actually, so what's his name? Gates will say it doesn't matter that he flies around the world on his private jet because he does some charitable projects. But, what matters is the view of the way that he is living that other people then have. So it does matter, the fact that you're doing a bit of philanthropy doesn't justify how you're living your life. So yes, the footprint thing was horrendous, really, really bad. But then we've had a bit of a turn on that where we have had some very activist people who are in their silos. So if they're active on climate, they're not thinking about, plastics, they're not thinking about biodiversity, and they're not thinking about inequality. It all matters.
Well, they are all connected because it is all interconnected. So class, privilege, wealth, it all plays into this. And you are right, saying we are responsible for the choices we make. But I'll be honest with you, I was just thinking about it in terms of the individual sitting there feeling guilty rather than a billionaire.
Yeah. It's not that, but equally some people have now taken the other side of it too far because it does matter.
Well, I'm going to say on that note that we could sit here for the next 3 hours and have this conversation, which wouldn't be any good for anybody on a day this hot. So I will just say thank you to you all for joining us today. I've found it fascinating and I've got a whole load of ideas I need to go away and research. I hope you have enjoyed it, and thank you for joining us at the first live stream for Shaken Not Burned.